husband, and I'm a dad. I pay for that habit by selling construction equipment, but I feel that way. It's a means to an end. My job is a means to an end, and that's always been what's important to me.
Hey, welcome to the podcast. We're glad that you're with us. I'm here with Sharon, and we just wanted to get things started and let you know we've got some great news.
Yeah, I have a great, exciting update to let everyone know that we have officially closed on the building.
All right.
So we are owners of 1225 William Blount Drive, which is very exciting. We closed on time. Everything went really well. It's a little overwhelming that right now, David, we own two buildings, but God is going to work all that out, and we're excited to move forward on this new one.
Awesome. It's a big sigh of relief that the closing has actually happened.
Yes.
So we're moving forward with 3 services coming up. September 11th.
That's right. September 11th. We're going back to our 3 services that we know and love, the 8:30, the 10, and the 11:30. We are, it's a quick turn and it's a lot on a Sunday morning and all those things, but we've done it before. We know it works. Honestly, the biggest thing is that if people can help us out, it would be for them to go to the 8:30. That's always a little bit harder, and we need the 8:30 to work to make it all work. But we're really excited that we've grown to the point, that we need the 3 services again.
Indeed. Well, we've got a great lineup today. We'll hear from Anna Kitko and Aaron. Let's talk through some exciting stuff coming up with Ratio Christi, as well as a really cool conversation between Aaron and Steve McCarter. That's Aaron's dad. You don't want to miss out. And just another reminder, you can find all this info at vineyardchurch.us, and then also our pretty slick app at Church Center. You can search for Vineyard in your area and you'll find it. But we are just so glad that you joined us for this podcast.
Well, hey everybody, I am here with Steve McCarter. And Steve McCarter, who, if you don't already know, is my dad. Hey, Dad.
Hey, how are you, son?
I'm good. Thanks for taking a few minutes to talk with us. We're going to talk about our church's anniversary here and the fact that we've hit 18 years, which is mind-blowing to me. I'm sure it's mind-blowing to you that you would have a son who's old enough to have led a church for 18 years.
Yeah, that's here, right?
Yeah. We're here now. As I thought about it, I thought, Sharon and I, we started making a list and we said, well, let's get the people who have been here all 18 years. And we ended up getting with a list that I was like, well, that's too many to have for a podcast. And I said, well, let's get Dad here because he can go before the 18 years, before this thing even gets started.
Yeah.
You were involved, but, so anyway, just a couple things here about you though before we get started. You're my dad. That's in my mind your claim to fame. But you got a couple other kids. My sisters Crystal and Farah, and all of your kids landed in ministry full time, doing that with their whole lives. Yeah. Which is probably why a lot of people around here assume that you're a pastor because I think maybe because. Like pastoring kind of runs in families a lot. So, but I get a lot of, your dad's a pastor, right? I'm like,
not even close.
No, works in heavy equipment, does this and that. And, but one of the things that's always meant a lot to me is that really you found your identity not in your career, but in being a dad, and you've taken that more than anything as your vocation. And I know that I at least have really benefited from that, obviously. But then my oldest sister, your first, Crystal, recently wrote a book called Learning to Trust the Father's Heart, and it's like mostly about you. I don't know a lot of people who've had books written about them.
Well, I wouldn't say it's about me, but I think it's about God. It's about her Heavenly Father. And I don't know if you remember or not, but all through your life, and my other kids too, I used to often refer to your other dad.
I do remember that.
The one you can't fool, you can't outsmart, the one that never messes up and leaves you alone. All those things.
Sees everything, knows everything.
He's it all. He's it all. You know. And I tried to
right.
steal a few pages out of his playbook.
Yeah, you did. You did. And then your other daughter, my other sister, Farah, she and her husband Nick lead the Canvas Vineyard, which is a church that we planted out of this church 15 years ago.
About, I think it is 15 years ago.
Yeah, I think they celebrated 15 not
When
too
we were
long
in
ago.
Friendsville.
Which is wild. That's. I think it sounds weirder to me that they've been out for 15 years than that we've been out for 18. That just sounds crazy. So a lot of ministry floating around our whole family.
Yeah.
So I was wondering that if you remembered when I called you and I said we were going to talk about before the church even started. Sharon and I were living in Florida at the time. We were there for just a bit, and I had stumbled on this idea that maybe now was the time to plant a church. And at the time I was 23, and I had since I was in high school, I knew I wanted to plant a church, but I was going to wait till I was like 35 or 40. And all of a sudden it's in the front of my mind in my early 20s. And you were my first call. Do you remember that call?
I do.
All right. How did that go?
Well, I you let me know that I wasn't surprised. I was just sort of waiting because I know you went to Florida because Sharon had a commitment there. Mm-hmm. And you went there and supported her and led music and did things like that at a church where she was ministering. But when that time was up, I felt like Sharon would, let's face it, she's your better half. And
agreed.
When you talk about my memories about this, it really goes back to when I made trips often to Chattanooga with the company I work for.
Yeah.
And I called you one time and said, I'm coming down. Would you like to catch lunch? And you said, could a friend come? I'd like you to meet my friend.
Could you see the air quotes through the phone?
Well, I was a little suspicious, but let's go see. But there was Sharon, and you asked me, not right there, but later, what do I think, and should you marry her, or what do you think about marrying her, or something to that effect? And I don't know if you remember, but I said, if you and your other dad are both sure, you got my blessing. So,
I do remember that.
So I think she goes way back beyond before you actually.
Yeah, I remember inviting you to take us out to eat because that was the only way I could afford to buy her a meal, is if you bought us a meal.
Yeah, we had a nice beefalo or something there, I think. But it was my pleasure.
Yeah, yeah, and that line rings out in my mind because again, that was the line of ask your other dad, or the reference to your other dad. Because I remember calling you and saying, this seems crazy. I know I'm way too young. This is ridiculous. What do you think? And I knew that you weren't going to tell me. I knew you weren't, because you're really slippery when you want really direct advice, especially when it's on a big thing. Because I think you knew already that I was going to come plant the church and that Sharon and I were going to go do that together. You knew, but I think you also knew that if I got too much encouragement based around Dad said it was a good idea, that when things really got hard, then I might wonder whether or not it was God's idea or if I was okay with it and just felt confident because Dad said it was a good idea.
Well, that goes back a long ways, and I'll never forget when you were much younger than we're talking about now. When you were 11, actually, and I believed then that you were going to go into the ministry, and I think you sort of knew it too.
I did.
In fact, you told me something to that effect, and that was one of the few times I really prayed and put it before God, and I said, God, I know you have to tell him. But how do I teach the young? I mean, I'm just a guy, I go to work and that's all.
I could argue that point, but
what
I'll
do
let you
what do I?
continue.
but the point was, I really implored God. How do I teach him? And if I've ever heard God, it was clearer than audible. It was not audible, but it's something I understood. And he said, "I'll teach him." So I tried to never cross that line. I really did. Number one, I'm not qualified to it. God always knows, and I leave calling you into the ministry, and my other children for that matter. You talked about me. I've always said, when people, even when I was younger, the age you started the church, and well, in my 20s, and people always, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a husband, and I'm a dad. I pay for that habit by selling construction equipment, but I feel that way. It's a means to an end. My job is a means to an end, and that's always been what's important to me, really important to me, and I'm thankful beyond the pale that I have 3 children. You mentioned Crystal, and she's authored a book now, but she and her husband Rob have literally been to all around the world.
Yes, they have.
Ministering to thousands and thousands of people. And Farah, who they're the pastors at a church there. Farah's my little defender of the week. She
is.
But and they also support ministries and have been in China and in
she defends
Central
the weak
America.
because she is not weak.
She is
strong enough to stand up to anybody, and
will. She
will.
That's her. That's what she does. And then of course you and Sharon and what you've done and I'm so happy that I don't have grief that a lot of my friends have from where their children. I have 3 children, and there are 3 spouses who I consider my children as well. 8 grandchildren, 4 great grandchildren. Every one of them loves Jesus today. Every one.
Praise the Lord.
All of my children and their spouses are in the ministry. 2 of my grandsons are already ministering, and I'm proud of them all, and I just felt that it was a good ride.
Well, and that's kind of the state of our family tree right now. But that wasn't the state of our family tree before. There are people who love the Lord for sure, but we've talked about this before, and it is another subject beyond what we're talking about today. But you changed the trajectory of our family line, and you and Mom together.
Well, I was just going to say, your mom's the one that wore her knees out. I prayed a lot because I needed the help. Vicki, she was busy praying for you guys, and but it's always what we both done. We did it together. We lived on a tight budget because we decided early on she would be a stay-at-home mom. You guys are what counts. Everything else is, and to me, it's her and the 3 of you at that time. But I know you know this, but there was a young lady when we first started the church, when you first started the church over off Alcoa Highway, the old Clayton building, who we sat in a small group, and she sat there in tears, and she said, I always wanted to minister, but all I get to do is raise these kids.
Wow.
And I just told her, I said, it's amazing to me you would say just raise children, because, to me, I never got in my little canoe and paddled up the river, but I stayed home and I built these 3 battleships, you see. And I think they've turned into aircraft carriers and more today. If you look at what's the 3 of you and your spouses and your children are doing, it's just, I just think it's terrific that you did that.
Well, we knew when we were little that I should even say, I didn't even conceive of the fact that there were people who put their careers ahead of their family. Like I was like, well into high school before I think I even knew that was a thing. And now as a pastor, I know it's an epidemic, but that was nowhere near the vibe in our home, nor was it ever. I'm really, really grateful for that. You mentioned the old Clayton building on Alcoa Highway.
Yeah.
And so getting back to the launch of our church now 18 years ago, I remember before it ever started, talking to you and saying, Dad, I don't know what I'm doing. We don't even have a place to meet. And we went driving around town trying to find places, praying and talking and not ever finding things. And until one day you did. Do you remember that day when you found us a place to meet?
Found it, went in and talked to the gals there, and they had a large room that was just perfect for a small church, and a little kitchenette, things we could use. Everything was fine. And so I grabbed you. We went over and talked to them, and I was so excited because they had all these nice facilities, chairs, everything you need. And she said it'd be $400 a month.
Yep.
And I remember you turned pale.
I remember nearly falling over.
Literally, you turned pale.
I'd never heard of so much money.
But as we walked out, you said, I can't. There's no way I could pay that. I mean, you were living in your grandmother's basement.
Yes, we were.
And you and your wife were working part-time trying to spend your, you and Sharon. And you know, I just remember saying, look, I'll get the first 2 months. After that, we'll see. And you never look back. I mean, 2 months from then, you were fine. You know, you started with you and Sharon and a group of people that had leadership ability and really loved the Lord, and that's the smartest thing you've done. You know, starting with Sharon, of course, but and I think about right now you're surrounded by people like Lindsay and Josh Armstrong and Natasha and you and David and you know, in spite of yourself, you've done great. So, just kidding.
It's remarkable, the team that we have, man. I told Sharon yesterday, I said, I've thought about it a long time. I said, there's every single person on our staff, and I went through the whole list. I said, I would literally fail at every single one of their jobs, except for maybe Lindsay's, but that's basically because she has the same job. I was like, if I had to do what David does, I would definitely fail. Johnny, I was like, I would fail immediately if I had to do what Johnny did. And I just went down the list, and the sad thing was Sharon was like, yeah, that's right. You'd fail at all those things.
Yeah, Sharon's brutally honest, isn't she? But,
yeah, she is.
But, you know, I remember, not just that, it's like, everything was going great. You filled the place out, or almost, and within a couple of months, starting with fewer than 12, probably 7 or 8 would be my guess. But then they said, the fire marshal says you can't meet here anymore, and you're out now. And so we found a little place in Holiday Inn, which smelled great, and Sharon hated it, and it was terrible. But we went from there to, I guess, from there directly over to the little church building there in Allenwood community. Spent some time there. There's where you first hit 300 people, or was it two or 300? You know, first time you scored 200 maybe.
200, it wouldn't have been 3.
It was 200 there. And then you found a building in Friendsville, moved over there. The problem with that is it's Friendsville, and he says we're Maryville Vineyard. So, But anyway, and then over to where we are now, and it was all a whole. You know,
made a big difference when we moved to this location. Man, everything changed. And then I feel like maybe we're setting up for something like that again with this new move coming.
Well, I think when you were 13 or so, you mentioned you were going to have a church someday right across from the high school where you were. Now I think it's a middle school or something now, but
it's actually more directly across the street from the high school than from the 9th grade academy. So it is,
really. Well, okay, but it's right where you sort of.
It's funny. I actually don't even remember that, but it's always been in my mind that.
Well, you sort of started there because you remember when you and the FCA had a meeting at the flagpole outside of the.
I do. I do.
You had this huge crowd of people that got saved and accepted the Lord, and then I got this call from the school superintendent, and I'm ready to defend. What he wanted to know was, would you be willing to go to the other high schools and do it, or would it be okay with me? I said, sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, you talk. Look, you brought more people to God before you were 13 than I have to date. So, but I take credit for all that. So.
There you go. That's the right.
And
move.
the others.
My sisters,
my
as
other
well, and all
siblings.
that. That's awesome. Well, Dad, thanks for being so faithful to our church for 18 years now. Thank you for giving me the courage helping give me the courage to take the leap. Thank you. We're finding that first building and noticing that I was about to pass out and agreeing to cover the first couple of months and all that came with it. It's meant the world to me. Yeah.
Thank you.
And thanks for taking time to come and chat with us.
Well, now if your other dad would sit here and do this for you, you'd really.
Then we'd get an audience, wouldn't we?
There you go.
Thanks, Dad. Well, hey everybody, I am here with Anna Kitco, and many of you know Anna, but perhaps some of you don't. Anna, thanks so much for taking a minute here to talk with us.
My very great privilege. Love it.
And Anna works for and with Ratio Christi, and we at our local Maryville Vineyard here, we interface with Ratio Christi because we host Ratio Christi community nights several times a year. And I'm not sure a lot of people have a broader sense of what you actually do day in and day out, in addition to what just happens to happen here at our church. Why don't you give us a rundown?
Yeah, Ratio Christi means Reason of Christ. And what it is a grassroots movement that it began with a bunch of pastors who were graduating seminary and getting their parish assignments, and they realized that there was a greater need and they were feeling called to do apologetics full time. And instead of get just another church plant going. Mm-hmm. And so instead they designed a framework that said what we want to do is have formally trained apologists who you can look at as interdenominational and who can operate interdenominationally, and you can look at the pedigree of. And we're going to use the university system as a network across the globe to plant these apologists, and it's going to come alongside pastors was the original goal.
Wow.
To relieve them of some of the duties that are supposed to be there in a parish that are overwhelming.
So I didn't even know that was actually part of the vision. I just thought you were being very nice.
No. When I say I work for you, just so you know, in case you need me, I'm here for you.
Yeah.
That's actually designed into the framework.
I did not know that.
That's my entire emphasis. So we build libraries for local pastors. We handle pesky congregants. Pesky congregants are our favorite people. Like, if you have lots of questions, we want you. And so your pastor can go, I am completely overwhelmed by that hyper-specific question about Hebrew grammar, but I know somebody who would kill to have coffee with you. And then the entire parish is served that way. And we can come alongside multiple churches at once.
Yeah.
That's the goal. So that was the original movement. And my assignment was University of Tennessee.
Right.
So that's why I'm here.
Yeah, and you came from Florida, right?
I came from Florida. Yep.
Yeah. And then tell me about some of the stuff you do on campus there. So that's the outreach to churches.
Right.
But what about on campus?
So on campus, we lead two major movements, and that is a worldview class, effectively. It's a group of students that get together, and we teach dialectic. And that means you bring in as many different alternative worldviews into one space, and we do a mini Areopagus. So the goal is that it's not a Bible study. There's no worship. Nobody's going to feel like I'm coming into, a secret Baptist club or, anything like that.
Right.
And they feel like they can talk about all the things that they maybe were not able to talk about in church, maybe, or in their own worldview. So, we'll have Islamic students that come in and ask questions they don't think they can ask.
Yeah. So you specifically said no worship. Is that because there can be an emotional element to worship?
It's not just because there can be an emotional element to worship. We just separate the worship out for the students who are already wanting to worship Yahweh. And we make it so that we don't surprise anybody who's coming in who may have had a church trauma, who's looking at us as kind of their last, this is your last chance Christianity to do what I think you've promised. And what we don't want to do is turn around and turn it into like a church that you didn't know was a church, but
Sure.
it's kind of doing it that way.
No
So-
accidental bait and switch going on.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. And then Ratio Christi Community Nights you do
Mm-hmm.
here, or we host them here. And it's been 2 or 3 years now that we've been doing this?
A
or
little
is it
longer
more?
than that. Yeah.
Is it
I think
longer?
it's
don't-
closer to 6 actually.
Holy moly.
Yeah. Yeah. I went back and looked
I'm so
recently.
bad at
No, I'm bad at
guessing
too. The
years.
only reason why I know that is because I went back and looked because I had to pull a really, really old one and I saw the date. Yeah.
That is wild. Okay. And this was kind of your idea?
This was
It's not happening other places.
It is not yet.
Yeah.
A couple other chapters have picked this up, not in the kind of the way that we've done it, but yeah, this came about because we're getting so many questions from the general public that I felt badly because our clubs are closed meetings so that the students can actually talk about really personal things and not worry about it getting out. Same thing with our professors. That's the other club, is we have an entirely run professor group that does the same thing. But I felt badly. The general public had questions, and I was like, well, why don't we just do a really giant group session and see what happens?
Yeah.
And that was the What is Truth, which was, a fairly reasonable showing for a really heady topic.
Yeah.
And then we had 250 people show up for that first manuscript night. And and I was like, well, maybe we need to keep doing
Yeah,
these.
there's a need here. People
Yeah.
are responding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. So we've got 3 of those coming up this fall.
Correct.
And just, I'll read it to get it right. One is happening September 11th. So that's this coming Sunday from when this will post.
Yeah.
Then October 9th and then November 11th. So that's actually the second Sunday of each of the upcoming months, and for three months. And then that's at 7:00 here at the Maryville Vineyard, and it goes till 8:30
Ish. Yeah.
Yeah. And tell us about the format, how that goes.
I try to speak for no longer than 45 minutes. Sometimes it goes into a little bit closer to an hour, depending upon how difficult the topic is.
You do a better job staying on time than I do.
I
Anna,
really
so
try.
that's noted.
It matters to me that people don't feel like I'm abusing their time because they're spending a Sunday evening with me. They could be doing literally anything else, and we're doing apologetics. So I want to make sure that they're served reasonably well, because I could probably ramble for hours if you let me. But then it's open Q&A, and the Q&A is open to all topics. It's not just the topic that's discussed, although the vast majority of questions end up being on the topic for the evening.
Yeah, but we've had plenty of them coming from all over the place. Yeah, and you stand up there and
Yeah.
give it your best shot, and
Yep.
usually nail it, and sometimes say I don't know, which I
hope so.
really appreciate your willingness to say
That's
I don't know.
very important for people to hear.
Or I don't know, but I know where to look, and
Mm-hmm.
and I'll circle back with you. And I have discovered that you actually do go look it up, circle back with
No,
people.
yeah, that's real.
When you say we'll have coffee, you actually do that, and
Yes.
you've had coffee with lots and lots of people who
Yes.
came loaded with questions. And I've appreciated that.
Okay, good.
Well, sometimes the apologist is they fly in, do the lecture, fly out, which.
Yeah.
I mean, to get to a certain scale, I guess that's how you do it. But
Yeah.
most of these things need to be worked out individually. So
They do, and I have a neuroses a little bit of like neglecting somebody accidentally, because like the parish distinction for apologists is the same for pastors, where if your parish gets too large, it's time to bring in another person because your work should still be on a personal level. So we have to be mindful of that to make sure nobody's neglected.
yeah, that's good. That's good. So for this fall, it sounds like you're responding to a whole load of questions that have come in,
Yes.
and there's been some themes that have developed. And
Yes.
so, is it fair to say that the 3 that are happening this fall are based on themes that have emerged?
Yes,
Does that sound right to you?
exclusively.
And
Yeah.
are these questions that people are giving you at previous Ratio Christi community nights, or these are just ones that are coming to you along the way? How's that work?
All across the board. So community nights, I use questions that the community members have brought me. So nothing from like outside. So keep it in like Knox Blount County, things like that. Guys up in Rowan County, things like that.
Yeah.
And then it's based on anything from emails to text messages to Anna, quick come here after church, or the little like sneak over and sit next to me during the worship service and be like, I have a question. Like, so all of those things, like they kind of merge together. And then I try to pick out the themes of things that I think people are desperate to hear somebody volunteer to talk about. And usually people show up when I volunteer to talk about them. So it's partially a guess, partially a I think this is where this is going.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this first one coming up this coming Sunday, it's going to be focused around sex, sexuality, sexual boundaries, things like that.
Yep, all of the above.
So how do you plan on approaching that? Because that's a doozy. I'm always impressed with your bravery, Anna. So how are you going with this one?
Half of my time is trying to look at all the things that I wish somebody had done when I was growing up, and then doing that, just so that at the very least people could be like, oh, I've never seen anybody volunteer to talk about that, and whoever's been to a Rush Christian community, I can be like, well, I have at least once, so they can say that.
Yes.
But with this one, I've been browbeating the hermeneutic circle. So we're teaching a Bible study here at church, and I've been browbeating it for deconstruction. This is technically deconstruction part 2. So the type of deconstruction that happens when you're actually abused inside the church, and I mean that on like a clinical level abuse. It's a different type of deconstruction. You're dealing with different pains. And so these 3 topics, my students very lovingly and very amused referred to it as sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which is not quite accurate, but it's close enough. And sex was the major theme for the amount of questions that I was receiving, and it's like way major, like over 80%. So much so that even the college students have asked for an entire semester devoted just to that topic across the board, anything they can think of. So we'll be doing that next semester for Sex Week and everything. But here for Community Night, I thought we'd hit it by going to Song of Songs and going through it hermeneutically.
Okay. So a broad scale fascination in sex and sexuality. Not surprising.
No, not even.
To be the way it goes.
Not even a little bit.
All right. So tell us what you're going to do with Song of Solomon, and just maybe a bit of a sneak peek of what your approach is going to be.
The sneak peek is, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the introduction, is that I took on this task because it's really hard to embarrass me. I like topics that are...
Which I took as a dare, by the way.
Well, wait, and you'll see there's another promo coming where I literally do that.
Oh, really? I'm easily embarrassed, so I would be blushing the whole time, but you... Okay, but
so it's one of my favorite things to talk about because it's so neglected.
That's right.
I really feel like it is. But what's interesting is I went back to my office. I have a big library, and I was like, we can totally handle this. Let's just pull as many commentaries as I can, get some reformers in here, get some Puritans, get the whole thing. And I suddenly realized, to my deep panic, that there aren't any. There are almost 0 commentaries on Song of Songs that aren't just Hebrew grammar. And so I don't have any other theologians to lean on to do this type of like the deep dive church history theology, because they've all avoided it. And I literally have quotes from every single era with major thinkers being like, I'm not touching that.
Really?
Yes. Like they're all scared of it. So I go to my childhood pastor who has 30 years worth of sermons that I go to when I'm panicky, just to be like, well, what did he have to say about this? I literally have a recording of him saying, I've never preached out of Song of Songs, and someday I might get the courage to do so.
Wow.
So this is as much of a test of Anna's ability to do hermeneutics as anything.
Yeah.
And I've decided, since it's so deep, Song of Songs is similar to Holy of Holies in that, like, this is supposed to be the penultimate example of intimacy on a physical level, along with spiritual level, along with a whole bunch of different layers. I mean, this is a giant onion of a book. But my specialty is the psychology aspect. And so I thought, well, I won't go anywhere that I'm not prepared to go, so that I don't shred the scriptures accidentally or put too much Anna in. And instead I will only go with what I absolutely can put my finger on as, this is the Hebrew grammar, this is what's going on, and to do the clinical analysis for it. So we'll be getting a systematic theology of medicine in sexuality.
That's going to be good. That sounds like a big challenge.
Yes.
I have a question.
Okay.
So Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, written by Solomon, and Solomon's pretty much the sex doctor of the Bible.
Yes.
And yet, he's not exactly a perfect model for us to follow. You talked about the penultimate example of intimacy. I don't think of deep intimacy when I think of at least how Solomon ended his life, or toward the end of his life.
No, thousands of wives by the end of his life.
So how are we supposed to think about that when he's written our main text and he's not exactly a paragon of virtue?
Yes. Well, when I read the text and I look at what's going on and how it's being phrased, it reminds me a lot of Ecclesiastes, which he is also the author of. And what's interesting is there's an entire section in Ecclesiastes where he talks about he is completely indulged in a hedonistic lifestyle just to see what it turns out. And in his infinite wisdom, and we all kind of saw this coming, he's like, this is a train wreck. This is horrible. So in my mind, to see this man who has all of this experience, especially when it comes to really horrible sexuality, and abuse, frankly, of his body and others, and the stuff that comes out and the things that we know about Solomon, for him to be the author of this book makes total sense because he would know.
He's been down all the roads. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and he's admitted it. So it makes total sense for him to be like, no, in his wisdom, to be able to produce this incredible poem that says this is what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Because he knows all the ways that it can go wrong.
How closely do we have the Song of Songs actually dated? Like, do we know well enough to know that he's on the other side of that wild streak that he had, or...
We don't. We don't have as precise a date, so that's me thinking I know him, having read him all these years. We don't have a precise date for Song of Songs, and it's possible that you'll see how it's structured, that he's not even really talking about himself. He wasn't seeing himself as the main character, the lover. He was imagining the lover as he should be, and it's not him.
Yeah.
And you kind of pick up on that in the text, especially given that this book, the main character is a female.
Yes, it is.
The beloved.
Well, you've heard me say it before, knowing better doesn't always add up to doing better.
No.
And unfortunately, we know from Solomon, wisest man who ever lived, but who later forsook that wisdom. And maybe this fits a little bit into one of those categories, but doesn't mean he couldn't speak to it.
No, not at all.
And with real inspiration as well.
And has in his other texts.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So any discussion on how we manage just the intense drives of sexuality itself? I mean, I think because maybe this is the marvelization of our society, but anything with great power, we tend to either make it a superhero or a supervillain. And sometimes it's just powerful, but it's neither of those two things. I think that's happened with sex. For some people, it's their hero and the champion that saves all. And for others, it is the most evil, vicious villain of them all.
Right.
And those are two extremes that people really tend to fall into.
Yes, especially within Christianity in particular. There seems to me to be a lack of ability to determine the middle ground between hedonism and asceticism. Like you're either completely Epicurean, like any urge is positive, and this is really the authentic you, and you're to follow each urge, and that's what you're supposed to do, and everything is free for you, no matter how damaging it could possibly be. And we see that in the different types of pornography. Right, and the things that are positive or seen as positive in the pornographic world, and the different levels, the way that violence has increased, things like that. But then the other side is asceticism, right? And that's anything sexual is a negative to the point of like we all hate the vulva. And have no idea how to navigate it. And that's a problem.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that all the way into clinical therapy. Like this is Yahweh's territory. This doesn't belong to the enemy, and it never has.
Amen.
So why does he have a monopoly on dictating what we do with those things?
Yeah. Well said. Okay. Well, I'm intrigued. We're all going to get together this Sunday night. Everyone but you is going to blush, and we're going to talk openly about sex and boundaries and sexuality.
Yes.
That's the first night. The second Ratio Christi Community Night. What should we expect for that one?
That one's the drugs aspect. So that's the second most asked question lately, and it's been coming in way more often. So if I had assessed the question types, and I hadn't stopped in like August, then we would get to the drugs aspect. And this is like, are all pharmaceuticals sin? Are the groups that are popping up locally that, say that any type of prescription drug needs to be gotten off of because it's sin and it's weakness and it's a lack of sanctification, and so they're bringing you in. It's a lack of faith.
If you trust God to heal you, then you won't take the meds.
Yes, precisely. And it's
that's an old story, but
Yes.
is that getting renewed emphasis? Because if so, it's kind of, is it specifically around drugs that are pointed toward mental health? Okay.
So like I happened to be part of a massive debate from my theological tradition recently that involved some pretty big names going back and forth in front of thousands of people on this subject. So that was part of why I was shocked that it was happening in that circle, because I come from a fairly systematic and robust theology that doesn't touch on drugs ever. So for that to be suddenly to have so many people with so many opinions suddenly pop up, that was odd to me. And then to have the amount of questions that were coming in on particularly mushrooms, the utilization of mushrooms and CBD.
Yes.
The CBD made sense because Tennessee now you can do Delta 8 and Delta 10 legally. And
Which are pretty powerful.
very,
Yeah.
very powerful. And then prescribing things, as alternatives. So like you can do CBD instead of Ambien, things like that. Is that allowed? What does that look like? What does that mean? Where are the boundaries? Nobody knows, right?
Yeah.
So I thought, well, let's talk about it,
Let's talk about it.
because we know actually on that subject way more than people realize.
How so?
Well, pharmakia, where we get pharmacology from, is a word in both Hebrew and Greek. I forget the Hebrew right now to be able to pronounce it, but what we translate pharmakia. There are two types in the scripture. And so a lot of times what I'm seeing is people conflating when the first type, pharmakia, is translated sorcery, versus when it's translated in a different way, the keepers of pharmakia, which tend to be clinicians in the New Testament. And I see that often conflated.
Yeah. Well, there's a time in which maybe the line between doctor and witch doctor isn't nearly as clear as it is today. Is that fair to say?
Very much so. And
Yeah.
especially in the first century, there were different kinds. And it was essentially like a drug dealer type scenario, but it depended upon the intention of the person and where they were trained and did they go to school, things like that.
Yeah.
So like white willow bark, that's something that was used. That's something you could anticipate Luke giving you as a cup of tea if you came to him really struggling. And now we look at it and I can see shamans using white willows to make sweat lodges, right? And you go in and you involve fire and you involve sweat for long periods of time with white willow, and everybody comes out and is like, I'm so rested, this is incredible. Yes, you just made a giant tea bag that you sat in for 3 days. The Christians have been doing that in a smaller form since time immemorial.
Yeah.
So just being able to navigate that world a little bit more than just like, it's magic. Like, I don't want to do that. Sorry.
Well, the explosion of science, just since the Enlightenment, the questions are entirely different and the approaches are entirely different. And what was once seen as purely mystical now has different categories laid over it.
Yes.
And as you mentioned it earlier, but the explosion in fascination and psychedelics right now has got my attention. It has definitely got my attention. Is that part of where you plan to go on that second night?
Yes, this is a huge deal, especially in my field, because, for example, Cave 4 in Qumran, where all those wonderful Old Testament scrolls came out of, there was a scroll that couldn't be read for half a century at least because of wine stains. And it got filed. And this just happened in the last month. It got filed for years and years and years. And we suspected it was probably Isaiah, some section of Isaiah or something like that, because we have big sections of that. And it wasn't. It was Esther, the missing book from the Qumran library that everybody was like, why isn't Esther here? It was there.
Wow.
Do you know how they figured out that it was Esther?
You're going to tell me, I bet.
They microdosed psilocybin mushrooms so they could steady their hands and they could focus their eyeballs. So biblical scholarship is now microdosing psilocybin in order to do their jobs better, solving biblical mysteries.
Really?
Yes, this just happened in the last 3 weeks. So now I'm sitting here going, okay, the FDA is fast-tracking psilocybin for treatment. We're fast-tracking other types of acid for PTSD treatment, which I treat on a daily basis in my office. And we're seeing treatments that are permanent and long-lasting after one trip. How do we navigate that?
Yes.
How can that be abused? Because it will be abused because we're humans.
Yes.
Where are the lines?
And it has been.
Oh my gosh.
It has been. So how different do we think about it just because there's regulation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how much of this is like Romans 13, the governing authorities over us, and now we're
Yes.
free to utilize these things, versus where do the Christians start forming boundaries so that we can make sure that our governing authorities aren't crossing any lines?
Yeah.
And then we have to watch, because I'm a cult specialist, we just have to start watching people lacing things in order to get control, because they can.
Yeah,
Because that's
to
how it
manipulate,
works.
for
You're
sure.
controlling the amygdala. That's how that process works.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm really looking forward then to Community Night 2, where you will remove all the ambiguity and gray from that entire discussion, and we will know how to get through all of that, because that sounds tricky.
I'm also looking forward to me doing that.
So surely the third Ratio Christi night then will be something very easy, low key, and non-controversial, right?
as usual.
Tell us what you
Yes.
got planned for that one.
So that one's I'm actually the most excited about, in the sense that its practical application is going to be immediate. We're going to be talking about critical theory, and we're going to be talking about it in its history, so that we can get a full picture of what's going on. And my hope is that we can then, as Christians, if we can navigate what's going on, we can take out the good parts
Yes.
and not bring in all of the bad parts. And we can also train others to do the same thing, because there's a lot of really wonderful aspects that are being abused and warped, and definitions are changing of words, and they know that, and it's purposeful, and it's engineered that way. And so it's simultaneously very difficult to navigate while being super obvious. I feel like the content is like, of course we like diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're Christians.
Exactly.
Like, why is this even a discussion?
Yeah.
And then you dig deeper and you're like, because there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's going along with it that doesn't have anything to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right. I mean, the fact that those are becoming buzzwords is kind of heartbreaking.
Yes.
Like those, I thought we were all on the same page with that. Well, I mean, to some extent, it seemed like there was unity, and in some sense, it feels like there's been steps backward in that regard instead of forward. So, but based on what you were saying, I guess it's fair to say that critical theory, critical theory, as it was originally presented, is something different than what we're hearing about in sound bites from pundits.
So much insane levels of documentation. Like when I show you, you're going to be like, "What?"
Yeah.
And it's literally designed to take out Christianity, and that's not just Anna saying that to sound dramatic. Like we have the quotes.
Like there's documentation.
It's literally
that
a
says,
cabal.
Wow.
That was what it was designed to be.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's stunning. When critical theory, as I tend to come across it, I have such a hard time parsing it out. And I've mentioned this to you before, because instead of anybody, I'm having a hard time finding people actually explaining what it originally was and was intended to be, versus how I think it's being used now, which seems like that to me. I'm so confused on this subject. Seems like very different things. And from one side of the spectrum, I'm hearing it explained in a way that is so histrionic and fearful that I don't trust the source.
Yeah, no kidding.
Because there's so much fear mongering around it.
Yes. And it couldn't possibly, you hear about it, it's like, how could that possibly be real? We are in 2022.
Right.
How could any of this be real?
Right.
Yeah, I get it.
But then the other, each sides of the discussion seems so reactive to the other side of the discussion that I have a really hard time just parsing out, like, what is even the meat and potatoes of the actual discussion? Like,
Yeah.
I haven't been able to track it. So maybe you'll be able to help put a finger on it. Because I frankly haven't been able to in my attempts.
I hope so. Ratio Christi has decided that we were going to spearhead that particular navigation as best we possibly could. We were the first to publish books on the subject. We've partnered with atheists and Christian apologists across the globe. So Peter Boghossian has partnered with us. James Lindsay has done work with us. And then on the other side, you've got Neil Shenvi, who does excellent work. Vadi Bakum has done a lot of work on this subject. He's real big with us as well. Last I checked, back when he was in the States. Now he's in Africa. But the point is like we literally have the entire gambit, the entire spectrum, and they all have exactly the same thing to say about this material. And these are guys who were present for these meetings.
Yeah. Wow.
And who are not Christians.
Yeah.
And who are as progressive as it gets.
Well, I'm happy to hear you say we're going to be able to pick out, or at least begin the process of picking out the best bits, because I've certainly heard things and thought, well, that sounds absolutely true. Like I don't have the mind to be able to encapsulate exactly what are and are not the systemic forces at play. It seems clear to me that there are systemic forces at play, but then that is being presented to me in a way that becomes almost like a ruling truth that governs all.
Yes.
And I was like, well, now that feels like an ideology.
Exactly.
And not in the good way, like in an ideology that is concerning to me if it's elevated to that. But what I honestly don't know is it actually being elevated to that degree, or is that fear-mongering pundits wanting me to think that it's being elevated to that degree? And I'm left dazed and confused.
Yeah.
So I'm excited that you're going to try to help bring a little bit of clarity, because
I hope so.
I'm left reeling by the conversation. I see things that seem beautiful and hopeful and true, and values that seem right, and then there are other things that just strike me in a way that I was like,
yes.
Even if this isn't, it's hard because I'm a pastor, I think first and foremost through like religious and theological categories. And so, but I should be able to say, okay, there are elements of critical theory that I don't understand how that can map over my Christian theology.
It's because it can't.
What little I do understand, there are
Right.
parts where I go, I just don't see how that could possibly map over mine. But that doesn't mean that there isn't truth there,
Right.
or there isn't something beneficial that we can be gained.
Right.
But I feel like I'm being encouraged that you either take all of it or you take none of it, or you take all of it or you're hostile to all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah, I think it's the natural proclivity of man to be as lazy as humanly possible when it comes to our, like when you have a really difficult subject matter. If you have an excuse to just completely disregard it, you'll take it because it's too much work to parse through all those things and take out the parts that are supposed to be good. But yeah, I agree. It's you get to the point where they're like the world is unjust, and you're like, yes. And we need to stand for justice. And the Christians are like, yes. And we need to be aware of the ways that different people groups are being marginalized. And we're like,
Yes.
absolutely, we're right there.
Yeah,
and
this
then they're
is
like,
straight from the pages of Scripture.
Yeah, and therefore, the entire world boils down to a power struggle. And therefore, we're going to justify using power to overpower the people who we think have power over us. And we're going to burn the world to the ground, right? You're right there with us, right, Christians? And we're like, what?
Lost me for a minute there.
How did we get to that conclusion? That's kind of what's going on.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I've got to think that there are voices that wouldn't take it to such extremes. And that it feels like we're in a context in which only the extreme voices are really heard.
Yes.
And those are the ones I most want to dismiss. But they're the ones I can only even seem to find. And I feel like I'm looking pretty hard for the measured, balanced perspectives that don't see everything as a zero-sum game, for example. And they're difficult to find. So I'm glad you've put a lot of thought into it, and I'll hope to learn some stuff. Because I feel very much like we can be 100% from the pages of Scripture completely on board for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to the nth degree, and then still maybe be able to say that doesn't mean this entire superstructure of thought maps over Christianity well, because I'm not always sure that it does. But that doesn't mean you're throwing out the whole thing.
Yeah.
I'm talking in circles. You'll do much better.
No. This is great.
You'll do much better.
This is great. I should have brought a
third
notebook
night.
so I can just take them. That's a bit.
Well, that's going to be a really challenging fall. I'm excited for all three of them.
Good.
Thank you so much for all the time and effort you put into this. Thank you for being available to people when they and we have lots and lots of questions. It's a real gift to our church. We really appreciate it.
I love my job anytime.
I love your language about truth never runs from scrutiny. So let's push and let's question and let's scrutinize and let's get closer to the truth in the process. And let's be kind in the doing. So,
Exactly. Because the entire body is edified that way. How else could it be?
Amen. Thank you, Anna Kiko.
Sure.